In the heart of London stands a palace where tours guide visitors through rooms filled with beautiful gowns and royal portraits. They talk about elegance, tradition, and centuries of British history. What they do not talk about is the screaming. They do not mention the 17 dead babies, the smallpox corpses, the mysterious death in an attic room, or the young girl imprisoned by her own mother in these very halls. This is the dark story of Kensington Palace. Not the version on the gift shop postcards, but the real one. A palace where queens died in agony, where princesses were locked away, where families destroyed each other behind closed doors, and where the British monarchy has spent 3 centuries hiding the truth about what really happened within these walls. There is a reason they do not tell this story on the public tours. There is a reason the official histories skip certain years, gloss over certain deaths, and change the subject when certain names come up. Because if people knew what Kensington Palace really was, they would stop calling it a royal residence and start calling it what the evidence suggests. Horrors. A place where privilege and power created suffering on a scale most people cannot imagine, and where the institution worked tirelessly to bury every uncomfortable truth. How many people had to die before Kensington's curse became undeniable? How many secrets can one building hold before the walls themselves seem guilty? And why, after everything that happened here, does the monarchy still use this palace, still send royals to live in the very rooms where others suffered and died? If you enjoy deep investigations into royal history and the truths they try to hide, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which royal residence to investigate next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. Thank you for being here. Let us begin. Christmas, 1699. Inside Kensington Palace, Mary II, Queen of England, Scotland and Ireland, is dying. She is 32 years old. 5 days earlier, she noticed the first spots on her skin. By the second day, the rash had spread across her body. By the third day, the pustules had begun to form, covering her face, her arms, her torso in the characteristic lesions of smallpox. The pain is extraordinary. Every inch of skin burns. Fever consumes her. The smell in the room, the sweet, sick odor of infection and dying flesh, makes attending servants retch. Her husband, William III, has fled, not out of cowardice, but because he cannot bear to watch. The doctors apply their useless treatments, mercury ointments that poison as much as they heal, bloodletting that weakens her further, prayer, which changes nothing. On December 28, 1694, Mary dies. The official cause is smallpox. The real cause is simpler. She lived in a palace with inadequate sanitation, surrounded by courtiers who carried diseases from London's filthy streets, in an era when even queens had no protection against epidemic illness. Her death at Kensington Palace was horrible, prolonged, and entirely preventable. It was also just the beginning. To understand why Kensington became what it became, you have to understand how William and Mary acquired it in the first place, and what they were running from. In 1689, William III and Mary II ascended to the British throne after the Glorious Revolution deposed Mary's father, James II. They needed a residence in London, but William had severe asthma that worsened in the smoke-filled air near the Thames. The old palaces, Whitehall and St. James, were in the heart of the city where coal fires and industrial pollution made breathing difficult for him. William needed somewhere cleaner, somewhere with better air. Nottingham House, as Kensington Palace was then called, sat on the western edge of London in the village of Kensington. The air was clearer. The location was close enough to the city for government business, but far enough away for William to breathe. In 1689, William purchased the property from the Earl of Nottingham for approximately £14,000, equivalent to several million today. Christopher Wren, the architect who rebuilt London after the Great Fire, received the commission to expand the house into something suitable for royalty. The work took several years. Wren added new wings, state apartments for both the King and Queen, a grand staircase, and formal gardens. The result was not grand by European standards. It was relatively modest, practical, built for comfort rather than display. Mary loved it initially. She threw herself into designing the gardens, importing Dutch plants, creating geometric beds in the style she had known in the Netherlands before becoming Queen of England. She decorated the apartments with her collection of Chinese porcelain, hundreds of pieces displayed on specially built shelves. For a few years, Kensington seemed like a refuge. The gardens became her solace. Then the smallpox came. Smallpox in 1694 was a death sentence for many who contracted it. The disease spread through contact with infected people or contaminated materials. In a palace full of servants, courtiers, and visitors moving between London and Kensington, infection was almost inevitable. Mary contracted it in late December. The speed of her decline shocked everyone. 1 week she was healthy and active. 10 days later, she was dead. William grieved genuinely. Whatever else was true about their marriage, and there were rumours, always rumours, he loved her. He stayed at Kensington after her death, but the palace had changed. It was no longer a refuge. It was the place where his wife had died horribly, where he had been powerless to save her, where death had demonstrated that not even royalty could escape disease. William lived 8 more years. He died in March 1702, officially from pneumonia following a riding accident at Hampton Court. His horse stumbled over a molehill, throwing William. He broke his collarbone, which became infected, which led to fever, which led to pneumonia, which killed him. He was 51 years old. Some historians note that William's health had been declining for years. The asthma that drove him to Kensington had worsened. He suffered from what may have been tuberculosis. The riding accident may have been the final blow to a body already failing. Others note something else. William died without legitimate children. His marriage to Mary had produced no heirs. Rumours circulated throughout his reign about his relationships with male courtiers, particularly 2 Dutch favourites who had followed him to England. Whether these relationships were romantic or simply close friendships remains debated, but the whispers were constant and damaging. The succession passed to Mary's sister, Anne. And with Anne, Kensington's reputation as a cursed palace became impossible to deny. Queen Anne moved into Kensington Palace in 1702, and she brought with her a history of obstetric catastrophe that defies comprehension. Between 1684 and 1700, Anne was pregnant at least 17 times. The exact number is disputed because some early miscarriages may not have been recorded. Of those 17 pregnancies, 13 ended in miscarriage or stillbirth. 4 children were born alive. 3 died in infancy. 1, William, Duke of Gloucester, survived to age 11 before dying of what was probably pneumonia in 1700. By the time Anne became queen at age 37, she had no living children. She would have no more pregnancies. The Stuart line, which had ruled Britain for a century, would end with her death. The medical explanations for Anne's obstetric history remain uncertain. Some historians suggest she suffered from systemic lupus erythematosus, an autoimmune condition that can cause recurrent pregnancy loss. Others propose antiphospholipid syndrome, which increases miscarriage risk. Still others point to the treatments she received, bloodletting and purging that may have made healthy pregnancies impossible. Whatever the medical cause, the psychological toll was devastating. Anne lived at Kensington Palace surrounded by nurseries that would never be used, by staff prepared to care for children who died before reaching them, and by the constant awareness that her body was simultaneously the source of dynastic continuity and the reason that continuity had failed. She spent 17 years at Kensington as queen. 17 years presiding over a palace that must have felt like a monument to reproductive failure. Her health deteriorated steadily. Gout made walking increasingly difficult. By her final years, she required servants to carry her. Obesity, possibly related to her medical conditions, worsened her mobility problems. She suffered what may have been strokes. On August 1, 1714, Anne died at Kensington Palace. She was 49 years old. She had outlived every one of her children. The throne passed to a distant German cousin, George I of Hanover, who spoke almost no English and had virtually no connection to Britain before his accession. The Stuart dynasty ended, the Georgian era began, and Kensington Palace entered its darkest chapter yet. George I had no interest in Kensington. He preferred St James's Palace and Hampton Court, but his son, George II, who became king in 1727, made Kensington his primary residence. George II and his wife, Caroline of Ansbach, transformed the palace into the centre of court life. But court life under the Georgians was not elegant or refined. It was brutal, dysfunctional, and poisoned by family hatreds that played out publicly. The relationship between George II and his son, Frederick, Prince of Wales, was one of the most toxic in British royal history. Father and son despised each other openly. The king banned Frederick from court. Frederick responded by setting up a rival court that attracted everyone the king had alienated. The feud split the aristocracy into competing factions. Policy, patronage, and political power all became weapons in a family war. Caroline, the Queen, sided with her husband against her own son. Her relationship with Frederick was cold at best, actively hostile at worst. When Frederick married without his parents' permission, the king expelled him from all royal residences. Frederick's wife, Augusta, went into labour while at Hampton Court. The king and queen refused to allow her to remain in a royal palace for the birth. Frederick had to transport his labouring wife across London in a carriage at night, risking her life and the child's, to get her somewhere his parents could not interfere. The child, the future King George III, survived. The damage to family relationships did not. Caroline died at Kensington Palace in 1737 at age 54. Her death was as horrible as Mary II's, though from different causes. She suffered from an umbilical hernia that had been worsening for years. 18th century medicine could do nothing. The hernia strangulated, cutting off blood supply to part of her intestine. The tissue died. Infection set in. Caroline endured 11 days of agony before dying in her apartments at Kensington. George II was present at her death. According to contemporary accounts, she urged him to remarry. He told her he would only have mistresses. That reply was apparently meant as a romantic declaration. Caroline died knowing her husband would never replace her, only demean her memory with affairs. Frederick, their son, was not permitted to visit during her final illness. The king maintained the family feud, even as his wife died. Frederick himself would die in 1751 at age 44, 9 years before his father, from causes that remain disputed. He never became king. His son would eventually inherit as George III, carrying forward the family dysfunction into a new generation. But before Frederick's death, Kensington witnessed another tragedy that the official histories gloss over or ignore entirely. Princess Sophia, George II's daughter, lived at Kensington Palace for most of her life. Born in 1700, she remained unmarried, serving as companion to her mother and later living quietly in her apartments after Caroline's death. In 1739, Sophia became seriously ill. The details are sparse. She was 39 years old, a decade past the age when most aristocratic women married. She had spent her adult life in a palace dominated by her father's rages and her brother's estrangement from the family. On November 29, 1747, Princess Sophia died in her apartments at Kensington. The official cause was recorded as a putrid sore throat, likely diphtheria or a similar infection. She was 47 years old. Her death attracted little public attention. She had never been politically important. She had lived her entire adult life in the shadow of more prominent relatives. But several contemporaries noted something strange about the circumstances. Sophia had been ill for weeks, possibly months, before her death. Servants reported that she had been confined to her rooms, that visitors were discouraged, that she had become increasingly withdrawn. Some whispered that her illness was not physical but mental, that she had suffered what would now be recognized as severe depression. Others suggested something darker: Sophia's isolation at Kensington, her unmarried status in an era when women's value was measured by marriage and childbirth, and the apparent indifference of her family to her suffering, all pointed to a woman whose life had been quietly crushed by the institution she served. Whether Sophia's death was from disease or from despair, the result was the same. Another royal woman dead at Kensington, mourned briefly if at all, and then erased from historical memory. The pattern was clear. Kensington was not merely unlucky. It was a place where women particularly seemed to suffer disproportionately. Mary dead from smallpox at 32. Anne's 17 dead children. Caroline's 11-day agony. Sophia's lonely death. The palace accumulated female suffering. Like other buildings, accumulate dust. After George II died in 1760, Kensington Palace fell into decline. George III never lived there. About the Georgian monarchy. The state apartments were closed. Rooms were left unfurnished. Sections of the palace were divided into grace and favour apartments, given to aristocrats down on their luck or to retired royal servants. By the early 19th century, Kensington Palace was a faded remnant, valuable only for its location and its potential to house minor royals who could not afford better. Then, in 1819, it became the setting for one of the most disturbing episodes in British royal history. On May 24, 1819, a child was born at Kensington Palace under circumstances that remain controversial 2 centuries later. The baby was Alexandrina Victoria, later known as Queen Victoria. The facts of her birth, as officially recorded, are straightforward. Her father, Edward, Duke of Kent, 4th son of George III, had married Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld in 1818. The marriage was part of a scramble among the king's sons to produce a legitimate heir after Princess Charlotte, the only legitimate grandchild in the direct line, died in childbirth in 1817. Edward brought his pregnant wife to Kensington Palace for the birth specifically to ensure the child would be born on British soil. The birth was difficult but successful. Mother and daughter survived. Edward paid off the German debts he had incurred before the marriage by borrowing against his future income. The family settled into apartments at Kensington Palace. 8 months later, Edward died of pneumonia. Victoria of Saxe-Coburg was left a widow with an infant daughter in a foreign country with almost no money and almost no support from the royal family. This is the official version. It omits several uncomfortable details. First, the speed and circumstances of Edward's marriage raise questions. He had lived for decades with his mistress, Madame de Saint-Laurent, in apparent domestic contentment. When the race for an heir began after Charlotte's death, Edward abandoned his mistress immediately and married Victoria of Saxe-Coburg within months. The marriage was transactional. Edward needed an heir to secure his place in the succession and the financial support that came with it. Victoria needed a position and security after her first marriage ended with her husband's death. Second, Edward's death 8 months after his daughter's birth was extraordinarily convenient for certain parties. His brother, the Duke of Cumberland, stood to inherit the throne if Victoria did not survive childhood. Cumberland had a reputation for ruthlessness and violence. Rumours circulated that he had murdered his valet and assaulted women. Whether Edward's death was natural or helped along remains unknowable, but the timing allowed Cumberland's influence to grow while Victoria's mother struggled to protect her infant daughter. Third, and most disturbing, the system that developed at Kensington Palace during Victoria's childhood amounted to institutional abuse orchestrated by her own mother and her mother's advisor, Sir John Conroy. The Kensington system isolated Victoria completely. She slept in her mother's room every night until the day she became queen at age 18. She was never allowed to be alone. She was forbidden to meet people outside a carefully controlled circle that maintained strict control over every aspect of her life. Her education was supervised to prevent her from developing independence or relationships that might threaten her mother's control. Conroy, who was almost certainly having an affair with Victoria's mother, positioned himself as the indispensable advisor who planned to dominate Victoria even after she became queen. The plan was to dominate her during childhood so completely that she would remain dependent on him and her mother after her accession. The Kensington system involved psychological manipulation, isolation, and what Victoria herself later described as extreme mental cruelty. She was told constantly that she was weak, that she was fragile, that she needed her mother's protection. When she became ill at age 16, possibly with typhoid, Conroy allegedly pressured her at her sickbed to sign documents granting him permanent power over her affairs. She refused. The moment Victoria became queen at age 18, on June 20th, 1837, she expelled her mother from her rooms, banned Conroy from court, and took control of her own life for the first time. She never forgave her mother. She never forgot the Kensington system. In her private journals, Victoria described her childhood at Kensington Palace as a nightmare of confinement and misery. The official histories downplay or ignore this entirely. They present Victoria's childhood as sheltered and protective rather than abusive and controlling. They erase Conroy's predatory behavior and her mother's collaboration in it. They sanitize the Kensington system into a quirk of parenting rather than a deliberate program of psychological control. The palace tour guides do not mention that a future Queen of England was imprisoned in these rooms. They do not explain the Kensington system. They do not acknowledge that what happened to Victoria would now be recognized as child abuse. Kensington Palace remained largely abandoned through Victoria's long reign. She hated the place and avoided it whenever possible. After she died in 1901, the palace continued as grace and favour housing for distant relatives and aristocrats with connections to the throne. It was not until the late 20th century that Kensington returned to public prominence, and once again, it became the setting for a royal woman's suffering. Princess Diana moved into Kensington Palace after her marriage to Prince Charles in 1981. The apartments were grand, beautifully appointed, close to the shops and restaurants of Kensington High Street. They should have been a comfortable home. They became a prison. Diana's experience at Kensington mirrors Victoria's in disturbing ways. Both women were isolated, controlled, and subjected to institutional cruelty behind palace walls. Both were told their feelings were invalid, their complaints were exaggerations, their distress was their own fault. Both lived under constant surveillance. Both were used by the institution and then discarded when they became inconvenient. Diana's early years at Kensington coincided with her growing eating disorders, her depression, and her increasing awareness that her marriage was a failure. Charles continued his relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles throughout. Diana was expected to perform publicly while suffering privately. The palace, which should have been a home, became the physical manifestation of her trapped life. Staff were loyal to Charles, to the institution, to the monarchy, not to her. Conversations were reported, movements were monitored, privacy was non-existent. Diana attempted suicide multiple times during her years at Kensington Palace. She threw herself down the stairs while pregnant. She cut her arms and legs with razors and lemon slicers. She was desperate for help and received none. The response from the royal family was not treatment or support, but instructions to hide her distress better, to protect the institution's image, to stop embarrassing them. When Diana finally separated from Charles in 1992 and divorced in 1996, she remained at Kensington Palace. The apartments became hers exclusively. For a brief period, it seemed she might finally find peace there. She redecorated. She entertained friends. She developed relationships and pursued causes she cared about without constant institutional interference. Then, on August 31st, 1997, Diana died in a car crash in Paris. She was 36 years old. The conspiracy theories began immediately. Was it an accident, or was it something else? The official inquiry concluded accident. Many remain unconvinced. What is not in dispute is that Diana spent 16 years at Kensington Palace, much of that time in profound distress, and that the institution failed her completely. Today, Kensington Palace functions partly as a working royal residence and partly as a tourist attraction. Prince William and Catherine live in one section with their children. Other apartments house minor royals. The staterooms are open to the public for tours. Visitors walk through the rooms where Diana lived, where Victoria was imprisoned, where queens died and princesses suffered. The tour guides tell stories about dresses and artwork. They talk about the elegance of royal life and the history of the monarchy. What they do not talk about is the abuse. They do not mention the Kensington system. They do not discuss Diana's suicide attempts. They do not acknowledge the pattern of female suffering that runs through this building like rot through wood. The official guidebooks present Kensington as a place where history happened, where important people lived, where tradition continues. They erase the violence, the control, the deaths, the cruelty. This is not accidental. This is the function of official history, to sanitize the past, to make the monarchy appear benevolent and continuous, to hide the truth about how power actually operates behind closed doors. But the evidence remains in the records for anyone willing to look. Court documents, private letters, medical reports, contemporaries' accounts. The evidence is there. Kensington Palace has been the setting for extraordinary suffering, much of it inflicted deliberately by the institution on vulnerable women who could not escape. The question is why the monarchy still uses this building. Why they send William and Catherine and their children to live in apartments where others suffered. Why they profit from tours that lie about what happened in these rooms. The answer is simple. Because they can. Because the institution is more important than truth. Because acknowledging what happened at Kensington Palace would mean acknowledging that the monarchy has always been willing to sacrifice individuals for its own continuity. And that continues today. The secrets are there. The dark history is there. The palace knows what happened within its walls. The only question is whether anyone outside the institution cares enough to force the truth into daylight, or whether the sanitized version will continue to be the only story most people hear. If you found this investigation valuable, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Tell me in the comments which royal scandal we should investigate next. Buckingham Palace's hidden history? Windsor Castle's dark secrets? Or perhaps something international? These stories deserve to be told properly. Thank you for watching. I will see you in the next investigation.